Hello everyone, welcome to the first part of lecture 8, and this discusses training and development. Now in recent years, training and development has been high on the political and managerial agenda. And this increased interest throughout the major economies of the world is driven by the belief that a skilled workforce is central to improving performance and competitiveness. And human resource management sees employees as a key resource for achieving organisational competitiveness. Employee development is the means through which organisational strategy and individual behaviour can be aligned. But as you would have appreciated from the unit on performance management, appraisals often highlight obstacles that prevent employees from contributing fully to the objectives of their organisation. And some of these obstacles centre on the employee lacking the skills needed to perform well. Training and development is required to provide these missing skills. Even organisations which have managed to recruit and select highly skilled people are unlikely to be able to avoid the need to train and develop their staff for very long, because skills will need updating and new skills will need to be learned. People will find themselves performing work that is very different from that they undertook when they first joined the organisation. And looking to the future, fundamental changes are anticipated in labour markets. For example, technological developments based on forms of artificial intelligence are likely to change the nature of work that is available in many economies. Now, all this means that developing human resources can be seen as an investment decision on the part of different agents, governments and businesses, but also individuals themselves. And these people are increasingly seen as personally responsible for ensuring that their skills and abilities are current and relevant. In other words, for all these parties, an investment in training spends time and money now in the expectation that the returns on investment, whether in terms of higher productivity or employability, improved quality or greater flexibility, that these returns will more than outweigh the initial cost. So investing in people through training and development potentially has many valuable consequences. But just as with any other investment, spending money just for the sake of it is unlikely to produce returns that will make the exercise worthwhile. Any investment in people needs to be as carefully thought out and evaluated against objectives as any other investment. Not only can training contribute to the organisation's ability to achieve its objectives, it can transform the lives and prospects of the individuals who work there. And this includes those who have yet to join the organisation. For example, many prospective employees will judge whether to work for an organisation partly on the opportunities for advancement that it offers them. And many of these opportunities are facilitated by the training and development that is given. Training and development is therefore central to the philosophy and practice of human resource management. An organisation's training provision will show whether it's treating its employees as a resource rather than a cost or commodity. For training to be effective, it must be an integral part of the organisation's strategy. So in this part of the lecture, we'll consider the importance of training and development for both the organisation and its employees. We shall set out some of the key decisions which we must take in planning training and development, and consider some frameworks which are used to analyse training needs. But in doing this, it will be important to recognise some of the rhetoric and misconceptions which affect the area in order to encourage you to take a more critical approach in assessing the prescriptions which are often offered. So let's begin by looking at the concept of human capital, and this concept underpins much of the emphasis on the importance of training and development that we see. Now, the human capital approach suggests that the decision to spend resources, time and money on training should be a rational one. It's comparable with the decision to invest in the latest machinery or technology, and consequently the decision should be assessed on a similar basis. So in practical terms, training and development is believed to increase the productivity of the individual or group being trained, and accordingly investment in training activities is desirable to the extent that the costs incurred will be less than the value of the increased performance expected. Now, this approach has several practical implications. The first implication is the need for information. If managers are able to decide whether to propose a training program, they need to know both the cost of that program and the value it will yield in financial terms. Now, most companies devote considerable attention to collecting and gathering information to help them make well-informed decisions on investments in capital equipment. And for example, this might include estimates of future income streams. But traditionally, human resource management has not acquired or utilised much of this kind of financial data. Many argue that one of the reasons for the low status of human resource managers in many Western firms is the failure of personnel managers to justify their decisions in financial terms. But it also should be noted that there are practical difficulties too. The quantification of people issues and the assessment of value that derives from their contribution is more difficult than with other forms of capital. Many of these are intangible in nature, and we'll examine some of these difficulties in more depth shortly. But another important consideration encouraged by the human capital approach is the mobility of capital. Now, what does this mean, mobility of capital? So in investing in employees, a company builds the human capital in each of them. It will be equipping employees with a mixture of firm-specific skills which relate to the particular techniques used by the company, but also more general skills. And these general skills will also be attractive to other employers. So accordingly, an employee may well decide to leave the company which has provided the training and development and accept a higher wage from another company who is keen to make use of their new renewed skills. So human capital theory highlights the need to consider the possibility that investment in general skills may lead to employees being poached by competitors before the organisation has had the chance to recoup the cost of the training. And additionally, the more flexible and fluid the labour market, the more difficult it will be for employees to protect the value of their investments in general skills. In other words, the benefit from an investment might be realized, might be obtained by a competitor. So this can provide a disincentive to invest. Now, the fact that an employee's position in the labour market is enhanced by the general skills that they possess and acquire also serves to remind us that training and development is not the exclusive responsibility of the employer. And in increasingly individualized labour markets in which different forms of self-employment are common, people are becoming more and more responsible for their own development in order to secure their futures. So we might be expected to invest in ourselves using the same criteria that firms use. So that is whether the investment will recoup its costs in terms of future earnings potential or improved work satisfaction. Now, there are several ways in which people bear some of the cost of training in general skills, bear the cost themselves. And this could be through a direct contribution to a training program or a higher qualification, which might be funded by a loan. Or it might be through more indirect means. So, for example, some professional occupations pay employees significantly less in a training period or an apprenticeship than in their subsequent employment. And so this effectively shares the cost of training with the employee. So let's try and assess the human capital approach. Now, although the human capital approach to training and development offers clear implications, many practitioners find that it over-rationalizes decisions taken in organizations. In practice, managers do not have access to the information that is required. For example, is it realistic to have precise information about, for example, the expected effect of a training program on someone's productivity? Many of the objectives and outcomes of training cannot be evaluated precisely. The intentions of training development often go beyond simply ensuring that people have particular job-related skills. They can also be a way of promoting an organization's values and its culture, and to promote desired behaviors in its staff. And these objectives are even more difficult to quantify. So, for example, a charity working to protect the welfare of young people needs staff who can detect problem situations in families. And any staff development program has to identify and cultivate these specific skills. But it will also seek to convey some of the values that underpin the organization's approach to child welfare and working with families. And these values might include a respect for difference, the importance of empowering those that the charity works with and affirming their own efforts and aspirations. So these values will also inform the content of training and how these courses are taught. And in these ways, the organization aims both to develop the competencies that are needed, but also reinforce its central values. So in this respect, staff training and development usually plays a vital role as part of a broader strategy of organizational change. For example, training sessions can be used to promote new approaches to improve interdepartmental relations, to encourage staff to come to terms with the need for change and devise their own solutions to new challenges. It's an important means of influencing the culture of an organisation. So in considering staff training and development, we must be concerned not just with individual learning, but broader processes of group and organisational change. And this includes instilling wider organisational norms in employees. So consequently, when thinking about and identifying and trying to evaluate training requirements, you will need to consider needs that are broader than specific job-related skills. These will relate to the culture of the organisation and will be motivated by the need to socialise members into its values. Now, we started the lecture by acknowledging that there is a growing emphasis on the need for training and development in modern economies. So let's look in more detail why this is. Now, the emphasis on the importance of training and development to competitiveness has been strongly linked to the idea of the knowledge economy. And here, under this idea, policymakers argue that learning, training and skills are the key levers to enhance productivity and raise living standards. For many, the new economy is a knowledge-based economy, and this is one where education and innovation are rewarded and valued more than ever and are fundamental to competitive advantage. Workers in this new economy are supposed to be adaptable, flexible, and engage in self-learning. These desirable attributes and the assumption that a skilled workforce is necessary to produce required goods and services is often reflected in governmental policies on competitiveness and economic growth. For example, the UK government have asserted that the future of the country's prosperity lies in the knowledge economy. This is as true of the manufacturing sector as it is of the service sector. We must strive to innovate, to produce high quality, value added products and services. And to do this, we have to ensure the right skills to support growth. The European Union has set a strategic target for it to become the world's leading knowledge economy. It specified the key conditions for achieving this goal as being the upgrading of skills, a high level of participation in lifelong learning, and the promotion of high quality jobs. Now, in evaluating this rhetoric, we must take a balanced view. Despite the popularization of the knowledge economy among by researchers and politicians, empirical evidence about employment trends suggests that many growing markets do not require skilled people. And this suggests that the much hoped for knowledge economy may be some way in the future. Frontline service work like home care assistants, restaurant servers, retail warehouse workers and call centre employees are a major area of employment growth, but they remain some distance removed from the knowledge economy. Workers here are valued for their numerical flexibility and are paid at or close to the minimum wage. And in the UK and the USA, much of the recent growth in employment has been in this sort of labour. And this labour symbolises the so-called gig economy, and this is where standards of employment protection and terms and conditions are poor. Many workers are effectively self-employed, and this has clear implications, as we saw earlier, for the resourcing of training. So consequently, the rhetoric concerning the high-skill economy tends to underplay the fact that the largest area of growth in many economies is in poorly rewarded service jobs. And whilst it might be the case that the people performing these low-skilled jobs are themselves increasingly qualified, as for example, traditional graduate recruitment is cut, this doesn't mean that the jobs themselves demand these skills or the economy is moving towards a high-skill one. And moreover, intensified global competition means that there is not just an increase in competition based on service quality, but there's also growth in price-based competition. Companies will seek out and utilize cheaper sources of labor. This means that managers will need skills that lead to service quality, but they will also try to minimize the costs involved in creating and delivering these skills. And you might be aware of the debates around the outsourcing of customer service functions to overseas call centres. Lastly, while the introduction of technology has inevitable impacts on skills, this is not a purely positive relationship. Jobs are both created and destroyed as the result of technological innovation. So at a macro level, at a macro level, we might assess the respective balance between jobs created and jobs lost and arrive at a neutral or positive assessment. But we also need to look at a micro level and consider the costs for individuals and communities as jobs are transformed and displaced. Transformations are rarely painless, and work is rarely created in the places that it has been lost. And throughout history, local economies have suffered as industries have declined, even though national economic growth has been maintained. Now, nor is work that involves technology necessarily highly skilled. Call centres are extremely technologically sophisticated workplaces, but few would consider them places of knowledge work. Consider the work that is done in the huge warehouses of global online retailers like Amazon, and consider what the human employee does in these environments. In the future, we'll see new forms of technology like artificial intelligence. And it's argued that artificial intelligence is different because the new machines will be able to do intellectual as well as routine physical tasks. Therefore, the technology is likely to replace skilled work rather than augment it. Consider, for example, the implications for employment of self-driving vehicles. It's often said that the accountancy profession is most under threat from the rise of artificial intelligence. One thing that almost all economists agree on is that change is coming, and the scale of scope and the scale and scope of this change will be unprecedented. Automation will impact different geographies, genders, and social economic classes in varying but significant ways. But in thinking about these pressures, we must bear in mind a central point. Environmental changes through market forces or technological development do not provide predictable or deterministic consequences. There are usually choices to be made about how work is designed, monitored and controlled. And these choices will affect skills in a range of different ways. So with these cautionary factors in mind, how should we recognize and fulfill training and development needs within organizations? Now, as you will recall from earlier in the module, the philosophy and approach of human resource management encourages a process whereby activities that were once the role of specialist personnel functions are shared with or even transferred to line managers. And this is especially true of training and development. And as we also saw previously, as attention has been increasingly focused on the value of companies' investment in training and investment in human capital, all managers are increasingly charged with developing and maintaining this investment. So the days when a specialist training or personnel department had exclusive responsibility for ensuring that employees were equipped with appropriate skills, these days are over. Now, of course, in some organisations, a specialist HR department may still take the lead in identifying commonly occurring training needs, and they may determine cost-effective means of meeting these needs and monitoring the progress of self-development plans and policies. It might also advise and assist line managers in the development of particular staff. But following the philosophy of HRM, it's the individual line manager who bears most of the responsibility for identifying and fulfilling their training needs. It's the line manager who knows the person's work, previous experience and their aspirations, and is therefore best placed to assist in that person's development. Now, it should be recognised that this form of staff development should not need or should not imply additional work. It's an aspect of activities that should happen anyway. And as you'll see in the online material for this unit, the term the learning organisation has been used to describe the kind of organisational culture which can be encouraged within an organisation to support the ongoing recognition of training and development. So, for example, if development is approached in an atmosphere of encouragement, and if people are regularly willing to take risks, to challenge each other and to learn from their mistakes, this can result in a climate where developmental opportunities are sought after and can be readily identified, and this is a so-called learning culture. Nevertheless, some developmental needs must be planned for. Most organisational life will involve change from time to time, and the demands of this change must be understood as far as it is possible. All organisations go through phases of formation, growth, establishment and maturity. Organisations may decide to pursue new lines of business or adopt new policies demanding new skills, and all this makes new demands on staff. Likewise, an individual's involvement in an organisation often goes through several different stages as they become responsible for a wider range of activities. The more predictable and definable these changes, the more likely it is that those involved will recognise and request the chance to learn skills that will help them in their new or future roles. But many transitions are not always so clear-cut or predictable in their effects and demands. Now, while we've noted the emphasis given by human resource management to adopt a more strategic approach to training and development, there remains the question of how training and development programs are formulated and implemented. There are many questions to consider. For example, who should take ultimate ownership of this process? How should the identified training needs be fulfilled? What are the most appropriate methods to use? And we'll consider some of these questions in the following section. Now, sometimes a need for training is clear. Wider conditions of change, for example, in the industry that the organisation operates and the technology it uses, are obvious indications of developmental needs. Another example is the specific problems that individuals and groups experience in their day-to-day work. For example, if someone is having trouble coping with particular demands, or the team is not working well together, then they may well benefit from opportunities to learn new ways of handling these difficulties. But in many cases, identifying specific training needs may not necessarily be straightforward. If people have been doing something for many years, they may not recognize difficulties. They perhaps have learned to accept them and think that they are somehow inevitable. They also may not recognize or may not be willing to recognize deficiencies in their own approach and ways to improve what they have become used to doing. But in most cases, I think, people will probably welcome an opportunity to make their work easier or to do it better. Consequently, effective training needs analysis cannot be made alone, either by managers or workers individually. The best analysis is achieved cooperatively. So, for example, individuals might make their own assessment of deficiencies in any work process. Their colleagues or the so-called internal customers of these processes will do likewise. And responsible managers might then negotiate with these different parties to find an agreeable set of outcomes which balances the needs and preferences of the different parties within the situation. And as you've seen in considering performance management, developmentally orientated appraisals lend themselves very well to this purpose because they represent an opportunity to consider a person's work in its entirety. Likewise, it's also an occasion to consider the whole person, their strengths and weaknesses, and their fit to their job. Such appraisals can be scheduled to offer a regular occasion when the manager can ask appraisees to collect their own thoughts, analyse their own performance, and make a more detached and rational assessment of the skill deficiencies affecting their work and how these deficiencies could be remedied. But you also should recognise that any process of judgment linked to appraisal will inevitably make individuals reluctant to admit their weaknesses. And this is why attaching any form of performance-related pay to an appraisal system can have detrimental consequences. Now the next step is to undertake a formal training needs analysis. Let's look at this formal process in more detail. Needs analysis involves several stages. The first stage involves identifying what the job actually involves, and this requires discussions with the job holder and those with whom they deal. This means understanding the job purpose, areas and responsibilities, and key activities and tasks. Secondly, the competencies, knowledge and attitudes that are required to do the job, distinguishing as far as possible between those that are essential and those that are desirable, are identified. Thirdly, a profile of the existing skills of the person doing the job on the basis of their past experience, qualifications and demonstrated ability in the workplace is drawn up, and this is matched with the list of the knowledge, skills and attitudes required. And if a significant gap is apparent between the required job and the existing skills, especially if a skill is particularly important for that job, then this is identified as a training need. Taking this formal approach has important benefits. It's systematic, so it helps to prevent irrational or political considerations intruding. It also can assist in setting priorities for the different training needs identified that are based on specific organisational requirements. But the approach works best with well-defined jobs that require specific skills and techniques which can be reliably developed with people willing to acquire them. But there are circumstances that are often found that complicate the use of this formal approach, and these include where the work is unstructured and fluid. Often in smaller organisations we find that roles are less specialised and defined. In some circumstances the skills and knowledge required may not be obvious from the lists of the key activities undertaken, and it may not be easy therefore to train a person in these abilities. Many skills are tacit and not readily identifiable or codified. Moreover, there's a further problem. How does a person recognise and judge his or her existing abilities in their work? As I said a moment ago, appraisal, particularly if it is linked to systems of reward, is often a place where people will be reluctant to admit their failings. And this is if they actually appreciate and recognise their weaknesses. Many do not. Therefore, it's often necessary to obtain several opinions on the work being assessed. A multi-perspective 360-degree approach often proves more successful than relying on the assessment of the job holder alone. Now, if there is a clear identification of training need, then this can inform the selection of a suitable training program. And the process of selection will involve choosing from a range of on-the-job and off-the-job training methods. On-the-job training is probably the most common approach, and it can range from relatively unsophisticated observe and copy methods to highly structured programs of job rotation, shadowing and mentoring. Overall, the main benefits of on-the-job training is that it facilitates the transfer of learning and involves limited cost. The limitations are that its effectiveness depends on trainers, so these are the line managers, mentors, the trainers' skills and willingness to engage with others. It can be disruptive to regular work, and in practice it's often haphazard and inconsistent. Competence in a task does not mean that one will be effective in training another person. Off-the-job training can take different forms. This can be informational methods such as formal programs and courses to more experiential methods such as role-playing and activity-based learning like survival courses. The main advantage of off-the-job training is that it may be helpful to get people away from their work environment in order to facilitate exposure to new ideas. The main problem with these methods is that unlike on-the-job training, it may be difficult to transfer the new skills and knowledge to the job situation. The approaches also tend to be quite expensive. So the appropriateness of training methods will depend on the size of the organization, the number of people involved, and the complexity of what needs to be learned. So let's look in a bit more detail at the available methods of training development, but recognizing that all methods have their own particular strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so let's begin with learning by doing. So this is where skills are learned from a skilled and experienced colleague. Although this approach is often criticized by training consultancies, when done well, the process can ensure that training closely meets the needs of the organization. But unfortunately, problems can arise when the skilled worker doing the instruction, although they may be extremely competent in their job, is not skilled in delivering training or doesn't have the necessary interpersonal skills to communicate effectively. And this can lead to frustrations for both parties as one struggles to understand explanations and the other cannot understand why it takes so long to pick up skills that they take for granted. Many experts fail to understand why someone has difficulty doing something that they themselves find easy. Mentoring and coaching. So this is an approach whereby a senior or experienced employee takes charge of the training and development of a new colleague. And the association is broader than the trainee-trainer relationship and means that the mentor acts as an advisor and a protector to the trainee throughout an extended period of career development. Shadowing and job rotation. Shadowing is usually used for management development and it aims to widen a trainee's organisation experience by assigning them to extended periods of working with managers in different departments. The success of this method strongly depends on the commitment of both parties. Trainees might consider the experience as not directly related to their work responsibilities and therefore time that's not well spent. And the receiving department might find hosting the trainee disruptive to their own work. Job rotation is a similar idea, and this is where workers are switched to different roles within the organisation. Job rotation was influenced by the quality of working life movement, and this saw increased job satisfaction as a means of raising the productivity of shop floor workers, and this satisfaction could be encouraged by providing workers with more varied and challenging work and also greater responsibilities. If workers are adequately trained for their different roles, then job rotation is an excellent method of achieving greater team working and empowerment at work. But in the absence of adequate preparation, workers may feel that they are simply being asked to do more work without being adequately compensated, and they may fear the consequences of poor performance. External courses and other forms of off-the-job training have often been criticised. Some employees will fail to see the relevance of the training to their day-to-day work and be inclined to dismiss them as a waste of time and money. But there are advantages to these methods. Sometimes it helps to remove people from the day-to-day demands of their working environment so that they have the time and space that's required to think innovatively and approach problems from new perspectives. New knowledge does not necessarily have to be directly and immediately applicable to be valuable. And as we've identified earlier, much training is about instilling desired values and cultures rather than more specific skills. Such courses can be interpreted in different ways by organisational members. For example, being sent on a course might be seen as a sign of approval. For example, the training is necessary as preparation for a promotion. But it also could be considered to be a message that the employee is inefficient in their work or some desirable change in their status is forthcoming. All this means that the purpose of any training provision and its motivations should be clearly communicated. Lastly, it's important to recognise that training is conducted for a reason. Therefore, it's necessary to consider how the effectiveness of training is to be assessed, both strategically in relation to wider organisational goals and also in developing specific needed skills. But much management literature argues that evaluation is one of the most neglected, although important, aspects of training and development. If training is not assessed, it's difficult to prove that it has been worthwhile, and therefore to convince anyone that investment should be repeated. However, the process of evaluation is not necessarily straightforward. And even the question of whose interest training fulfills is questionable. For example, the interest of the individual in seeking opportunity and self-development need not necessarily accord with organisational goals, which can be more specific and short-term in focus. And as we saw earlier when we discussed the human capital approach, is it possible to quantifiably measure whether a training and development intervention has added value to human capital? Consequently, as with other aspects of the training process, it's argued that training effectiveness should be examined at several levels, and the identification of these levels is commonly influenced by Kirkpatrick's model, and these levels are as followed. Firstly, reaction, and this level taps trainees' views of any training program, and a familiar type of evaluation at this level is a post-course questionnaire. The problem with this level of analysis is that it evaluates the course itself rather than the participants' actual learning. It also assumes that training is a discrete event that can be identified and particularly assessed. The second level is learning, and this is where we aim to uncover whether trainees show evidence that they have achieved the desired learning objectives. And here the specific evaluation would focus on the extent to which trainees have mastered relevant concepts, knowledge and skills. And this could be assessed, measured through pre- and post-training tests. Now, while the evaluation of learning is useful, it often remains incomplete. So, for example, trainees may have learned and understood new concepts and ideas, but not actually transferred them to the workplace. So the transfer from learning to behaviour is the necessary focus of the next level of evaluation. So that's behaviour. So at this level, the evaluation is concerned with assessing the impact of training on behaviour. So it involves comparing trainees' behaviour before and after training and assessing the extent to which their performance has changed in a desired fashion. And this could be done through performance appraisal or through some process of job evaluation. The last level of evaluation is organisational results. And this is the extent to which training has had an impact on wider effectiveness. And information can be collected on a wide range of organisational measures, such as customer satisfaction, productivity, staff turnover, or quality improvements. Now, this level of evaluation is particularly difficult since any change in these organisation-wide measures could have been brought about by other factors other than the training interventions. So attributing outcomes to specific training processes and the contribution of particular individuals is often problematic. Now obviously, given the nature of the job, the skills required and the training methods used, the emphasis given to particular levels and the associated methods of evaluation may differ. Some jobs may have more readily identifiable outputs that can be rationally measured to determine the effects of training interventions than others. Other jobs, perhaps requiring softer skills or consisting of a combination of complex activities, will have less tangible outputs. And in these contexts, both methods of training and the means of their evaluation will require careful consideration. Okay, so the idea of developing people is full of positive associations. It fits well with the mission and values of many organisations, particularly those who are service orientated and who emphasise the importance of their people to achieving competitive advantage. And it's an aspect of management that many people find rewarding, as it leads to both personal and collective development. It's an activity that is entirely consistent with the philosophy and aspirations of strategic human resource management. But as we've seen, there are a number of potential problems that must be confronted. And as we identified earlier when we discussed the human capital approach, it's difficult to establish a direct relationship between training provision and organisational performance. The impact of training on the bottom line is hard to measure. These problems will influence assessment of both training needs and training development, but they also impact upon the willingness to fund training programs if the benefits are not easily defined. Competing priorities and objectives, for example, between individual employees and the organisation, or between short-term and long-term goals, often exist and serve to undermine the effectiveness of training in encouraging learning, development and improved performance. We also have noted that many organisations depend on controlling costs, and this can contradict and prevent the development of a high-skilled workforce. The effect of training and development on employees' attitudes and commitment is also complex. Training does have the potential to influence positive commitment and motivation and improve performance, but only to the extent that it's integrated within a coherent package of human resource management strategies. Contradictions between rhetoric and reality will inevitably impact upon how training programs are received by staff and their effectiveness in facilitating behavioural change. In other words, training is most likely to have a positive impact on motivation, performance and commitment when it is linked to promotion, rewards, future employment prospects, and the chance to use the skills developed during training whilst actually on the job. So consequently, the message here is of the importance of an integrated and coherent approach to human resource management. So let's draw together some conclusions to this part of the lecture. You should now recognize the centrality of training and development to the philosophy of human resource management. And in the so-called knowledge economy, this becomes even more important. It implies that training is the prime form of investment that organizations can make. Therefore, the identification of training needs and the formulation of effective training programs to meet these needs is of vital importance. If human resource management is to be something more than managerial rhetoric, then employees must be treated as a resource rather than a cost or commodity. However, you should also appreciate the many difficulties involved in the process, and in particular of evaluated training provision. The idea of a learning organization insists that training and development should be integrated into everyday work activities, so forming a continuous process. So, in this spirit, we've considered how we might approach the provision of training and development so that we can recognize both our own needs but also other people's and make effective provision for them. Okay, so now look at the lecture forum where you'll find an exercise to complete that embraces these different issues. And thanks for your attention to the lecture, and hope you find it interesting.